Okay, now, so we've seen mother language education comes out of God's design and out of God's character. Both principles, God's design, God's character. He creates a diversity of languages, gives the family the responsibility to teach their children. He gives each people group a property. And I skipped one slide, but when Israel was coming from Egypt, he said, don't conquer Moab, Ammon, and Esau. I've given them their land, but I've given you your land. And you can drive those other people out only because they're so wicked that they deserve the death penalty. You can remember what's happening. All the little children were being burned in the fire. There was incest. All the fathers and probably the mothers were sleeping with their children. They sold their children to the temples for the temple prostitution. It was so totally corrupt, God says, destroy them. Now, we don't have that right because we don't have any more prophets. So we don't destroy anybody. Our job is to live in the land God gives to us and to live righteously, have children, and bring others in our own people and in other people groups to know the living true God. Those who want to join with the Afrikaner people in their land, they should have the freedom to do that. Now that's a little bit controversial from what the old Afrikaners would say. Now where does imperialism, anti-imperialism come from? Look at Tower of Babel. It was an imperial centralized state. We want to be one nation, one language, one people. Many scholars will see this that have nothing to do with apartheid. They just say it's an anti-imperialist pericope, an account. One nation, one language, one king, Nimrod. Well, where did the Roman Empire develop this doctrine that there should be one people, one emperor, and one language, Latin? You know where it came from? Eusebius, a church father, who went back to Tower of Babel, and he said, no, the languages are a fluke. We should reverse Babel and restore unity to the world under the emperor and under the pope and under the Latin language, and the whole world will be one. Well, that's not what the story says. God says, I want you to scatter and fill the earth. And then the very next chapter he calls Abraham. And what does he tell to Abraham? Go and be a blessing to every people and clan and folk and tal of the earth. Abraham's people are to go do that. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, you've been adopted into Abraham's family. But as Calvin says, there's going to be one nation with one king, but all peoples were going to be in with that one nation. Analogous to the British Commonwealth. One king or queen, all the nations under that king. Well, that's the goal of the Koninkrijk van Jesus. We must disciple all the nations. It doesn't say disciple every individual, disciple all the nations. So that they would serve the one king. They would see themselves as the children of Abraham, but there will be all the nations. Romans 4 says that too. He shall be the father of the many nations, or of all the nations. Now, if you destroy the nations that God created, like the English did, and like the French did, and like the Romans did, and like the Mongols did, and like the Xhosa and the Zulu are doing now, then what? You inherit God's curse. Now let's look at two chapters, Habakkuk and Isaiah. Isaiah says this. Let's see, do we have Habakkuk? Isaiah says this. He's talking about the Chaldeans. No, he's talking here about the Assyrians. He says, by the strength of my hand, the king of Assyria said, I've done this. And by my wisdom, because I've understanding, I've removed the boundaries of the nations. I plundered their treasures like a mighty one. I subdued their kings. As one reaches into a nest, so my hand reached into the wealth of the nations. As people gather abandoned eggs, so I gathered all the countries. Not one of them flapped a wing or opened its mouth to chirp. No, the Afrikaners, they opened their mouth and they chirped very loud. Fought long and hard. Does the axe raise itself above the person who swings it, or the saw boast against the one who uses it? As if a rod were to wield the person who lifts it up, or a club brandishes the one who is not wood? God says, I've sent the Assyrians against you, but I'm going to judge the Assyrians for coming against you. So it's kind of interesting. God is very much against imperialism. In Habakkuk, he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans in the Afrikaans, the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves. Sounds like the Mongolians and the British and the French and the, klomp ou oomies het daar gesit en dat het alle die lyne getrek en sê, okay, hierdie is vir die Mozambikers of die Portugees en hierdie is vir die Franse, hier is vir die Italianers en die Duitse krijg toe Tanzania en Suid-West-Afrika en die Britten krijg alles anders. They're a law to themselves and they promote their own honor. My friend said, he's a British guy, and he believes the same things the Puka do, and believes in the sovereignty of God over all of life and things. He goes, but why does this Afrikaner nation want to keep their language? Everybody should accept English. And then he says, Rule Britannia! That's how he ended his little... He was imperialist. And they say, well, you're a racist if you speak Afrikaans. So what's the solution? The language of the oppressor. Wat is die taal van de onderdrukker? Engels. Het is baie ironisch voor mij. Die Soetus en alle die anderen say dat die Afrikaanse taal is die taal van de onderdrukker. In elk geval. Okay. Then he says, their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen came from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping in to devour. They are all intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. Sounds like the Anglo-Boer oorlog. They mock Paul, scoff at, what was the president of the Vrystaat? Steyn. I was going to say, but I was scared to say it. They laugh at all their cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. They sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their own God. That's imperialism. So does God love imperialism? No. He's given each people the land. And I think the solution for Africa is 500 countries or more. Maybe 1,000. And it'll come. People get tired of being oppressed by people of other language and forced to have different cultures and different languages. But our whole Western civilization, I think, will have to collapse before that'll happen. But that could happen within the next 50 to 100 years. Onthou, Amerika is nou $20 triljoen in skuld. So covenant land is given to a people, but with boundaries. But the boundaries are there to glorify God. If the people refuse to glorify God, they break the first 4 of the rights and responsibilities. God removes them from the land. So God gives each nation their inheritance and its borders, but He also gives privat eiendom binnein. Can I remember what God gave? He gave each family a piece of property. And He did not want that property to be volksvervreemd. Remember that every 50 years He kept the property back to the original people. If the foreigners came, they couldn't own the property out in the platteland. They could only own a house in the city until they become assimilated. And it takes 3 generations to assimilate into America and into the Jewish culture. It says it in Deuteronomy 20, verse 1 to 7. So God has the answers to all of these things if we would follow His wisdom. So then, how are we to protect the community boundaries and to help decolonize? Die Volkskommandoeenhede. I've got a friend in Dumini in America. He says, we're prepared when the whole thing falls apart. He took me down to the kelder of his church, and he had about 100 brand new boxes of AK-47. Sy lidmaat was bereid. That's what the Afrikaner did. They didn't have a centralized army. They called up the Boere commando eenhede. The same thing in the American War of Independence. It was the militias of each state which fought against each other. The American Central Army was very small at the time. So, covenant stipulations, God gives us the command to bewoon, bevolk, bewerk, and bewaar onder God. And if we don't, He takes away our population. Afrikaner is no verkrimp. Krimp. Yeah, verkrimp. Verkrimp. What is it? 20% every 20 years? Because we're under population growth level. How many children does it take per family to have the population grow?
At least
3. There's no such thing as 2.1 children. You have to have 3. So one of the things that I would really love to see Solidariteit in Afriforum is to say, put out posters with 4 children for each one. And remember that FIFI always put out only 2 children, or maybe 1 child. If you notice, from 64 to the present, the United Nations is pushing 0 population growth. Well, it's leading, actually, Elon Musk just gave a tweet. He says, the world's population is busy to collapse, and no one cares. The Muslims care. They have many children. You know what the number 1 boy's name in Britain is now? Mohammed. They call London Londonstan. The mayor is a Muslim. En hulle steek almal dood. If you don't inhabit, populate, work, and protect, God removes the people from the land. So in summary, God creates cultures. He creates languages, and they're very good. God created each people group to protect their own unique language and the property that God gave to them, both individual property and collective property. God is 3, that's the individual, and He's 1. He protects His unity, both and. God moves peoples into their property. Property rights comes from God's character and God's design. The same with education, come from His character and from His design. And every other basic principle comes out of those 2 things, God's character and God's design. Now, since God gives each people a land and boundaries, imperial powers must never remove them. And if they do, it's the responsibility of Christian people to stand up, say that it's verkeerd. I would love to see the Doper Kerk stand up and have an official delegation and say, Mr. Ramaphosa, this is evil. You cannot do that. Je mag dit nie doen nie. Now, but the reality is they won't listen. So the Afrikaner must be prepared to trek laar and protect that which, some areas that are defensible. By doing what the old Middle Ages did, what did they do? They made a stadsmuur with the hek. And the land around it, they were prepared to leave and go into the city when they're invaded, but the land around is the stads land. There's got to be a mini Afrikaner stadstade, dink ek. Okay, I was talking with HP and what was the other? Hannes, yeah, about that. They were from the Krach, what is it? Krachtdag Owens the other day, and that's what they said. We want to see lots of little mini Afrikaner states, and then as they grow, to move the walls out further.